Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone! Welcome back to the Therapy and Prayer podcast. My name is Camille. I'm your host, and I am so happy that you're here as always. I hope that y'all are doing good. I'm doing good. Let me tell you a part of why I'm excited. We officially hit over 5,000 subscribers here on YouTube. I know that's chump change for some people, but for me, that is a huge milestone, and I'm just so thankful. I've been thanking God all week because when I started this podcast, I wasn't thinking about no numbers at all. So to think about 5,000 people being here and hearing what I have to say and deepening their relationship with God because of what I'm having to say and because of what God is doing through me, it's such a blessing and such an honor. And I'm really excited about it. So thank y'all so much for being here. Those of you who are new and those of you who have been around for a while, we're just going to keep going. We're just going to keep going. I'm trying to think about some ways to maybe engage with our little community here a little bit more personally. So be on the lookout for that. But thank you for being here. All right, let's jump into today's episode. I'm excited about today's episode. I'm excited about most of them, but this is another topic that has been highly requested. I know that we've talked about relationships in a few different ways. We talked about boundaries, we talked about forgiveness, and today we're talking about codependency. This is a big one for us. And so we're going to get into all of that and, of course, the spiritual implications. Almost forgot. See, I'm still trying to get used to this before I forget. If you haven't already subscribed as one of the 5,000 people, go ahead and join the number. Make sure that you're subscribed here on YouTube or that you're following on the audio platforms that you're listening to. You can also find me on social media at Therapy and Prayer. Okay, we got the business out the way. So let's get into codependency a little bit. Now, I probably would classify codependency as an attachment style. We've talked about attachment before. If you are not familiar, check out the episode that I did on that a while ago. But generally speaking, there are 3 types of attachment: anxious, avoidant, and secure. The reason that I would classify codependency as an unhealthy attachment style is because it really has to do with the ways that we connect with people and the type of connection that we have. So let's get a definition. It's important that we define this because this is one of those buzzwords and one of those words and terms that's thrown around a whole lot and is sometimes misused. And I want us to define it because there might be some of us who are in codependent relationships without knowing. So this might give us a little bit of revelation as well. So the definition of codependency is excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a person. So originally, codependency was used and was seen mostly in people who suffer from serious mental illnesses or addiction. And the people who are in their lives, their family members, caregivers, friends, are the ones who develop this codependent relationship. Now, usually when we think about codependency, we envision someone who can't live without someone else, right? Like I need you. But really, the definition is talking about the person who becomes the one that is relied on. That is the person who is identified as codependent, which sounds a little bit backwards, but we'll get into a little bit of that later. One of the dangers of codependency in relationships is that it can really lead to enabling. And this is some of that language, again, that comes along with addiction and mental illness. But one of the ways that I like to describe it is that when you are in a codependent relationship or when you are someone who is codependent, you take on the responsibility of someone else's emotional well-being. It becomes your job to make sure that the other person is okay emotionally, mentally, psychologically. And the lengths that we go to in order to make sure that someone else is doing okay mentally can lead to a lot of enabling, because we always just want to make sure that they're happy and that they're okay and that they have what they want and that they have what they need, and we don't want them to be upset or hurting or in any kind of pain. And when we are talking about addiction and things, we're not going to spend today talking about addiction completely, but I think it's important that we pull out some things because it translates to other dysfunctional relationships too. But when we're talking about people who struggle with addiction and the codependent people in their lives, sometimes we will excuse certain behaviors, or we will kind of like give in and allow them to cross boundaries that we've set because we're wanting to maintain the relationship. So it comes down to making sure that the other person's well-being and mental status is okay, but also to like maintain the relationship, we will just disregard our boundaries and our own well-being for the sake of someone else's. And that can develop into enabling behavior. So while addiction and mental illness is the first and kind of primary place that we see codependency, and that's kind of where the term comes from, generally speaking, if you find yourself in codependent relationships, then there's a likelihood that that could have developed from some dysfunctional relationships in your early upbringing. Maybe you came from a family that didn't have the healthiest relationships, or you came from a family of codependency. What that might look like is that maybe a child is responsible for making sure that mom is always okay, or that dad never gets angry, or that that brother or sister like always has what they want or always has what they need, or that they get angry really easily, so just like make sure that you don't upset them. There is a lot of dysfunction sometimes in households that are run that way. If you have grown up in an environment like this, where the whole house kind of operated around one person's mood, that's what we're talking about. If this one person is not okay, then nothing else in the house is okay, and no one else in the house is okay. Therefore, the people around that one person take on the responsibility of making sure that they're okay, because that's what's going to make sure that the rest of us stay safe. So it really turns into a kind of a traumatic relationship experience, because in order to secure your own safety, whether that be mentally, emotionally, and sometimes even physically, to ensure your own safety, you have to make sure that the other person is happy. Otherwise, this becomes an unsafe environment for me and for everyone else. So it is a survival technique sometimes. Now, even though it's born out of that, when that's happening in your early childhood relationships, then that is what you're going to take into your other relationships. So if as a child, you're responsible for someone else's mood and for someone else's mental health and for someone else's emotions, then that's how you learn to be in relationships in general. So there's a high likelihood that you will find yourself in other kind of dysfunctional relationships. One of the ways that you can tell that this relationship may not be the healthiest is if it really revolves around one person in it. If there's a person in the relationship that is like extremely needy, and then there's a person in the relationship who is always trying to meet the need, that could be a codependent relationship. But that's where you're going to find yourself if this is your attachment style. Just like with every other attachment style, we're going to seek out relationships that mirror those of our primary experiences and of our primary relationships. So if your primary relationships are full of this kind of dysfunction and codependency, then that's what you're going to seek out, because that is all that you know. So even though codependency is not a technical attachment style, it operates like one, because it lays the foundation for the kind of relationships that you seek out and find yourself in. It lays the foundation for the relationship patterns that we're going to see as we go throughout our life. The reason that the term codependent is applied to the one who is meeting the need and not to the one who has the need is because when you are in that position, you kind of become like the caretaker. But that has a way of becoming how you identify yourself in this relationship. So essentially, you become dependent on the other person being needy. You need them to need you, basically. And that's the co in the codependency, right? We need each other. I need you to meet my needs because I'm dysregulated and because I have these toxic patterns and because I maybe am a little bit manipulative and I need to feel important. And I need you to need me. Otherwise, if you don't need me, then what am I doing here? That's the only way that I know you love me, is if you need me. So we get into this cycle with one another, and it just gets really toxic and really, really unhealthy. We actually see it a lot in parents and children. If there was some loss or trauma in the household, or like, let's say if there was a child in the household who had to grow up really quickly, and we call that a parentified child, like you had to take care of your siblings, or you had to take care of your parent maybe, and now the parent relies on their child to have the needs met, and then the child grows up and feels like they can't move out the house because they can't leave their parent, and there's a lot of like resentment that comes in that, but also a lot of enabling, because now you're allowing your parent to like not feel like they have to go and get a job because you have a job and you're paying the bills, but you resent them for it because you're paying the bills for someone else instead of living your own life. But it's all that you know. And if you leave, then you feel like you're going to lose that relationship completely, and you're going to feel unloved by a parent. So I can't leave because that's my mom. It's a lot. It is a lot. And it is like really enmeshed into the fabric of that relationship. That relationship, it can't really stand if the codependency is not a part of it. And so while codependency kind of starts as caretaking, it evolves into an identity. And as I was reading up on codependency a bit for this episode, I was seeing that not only does it evolve into an identity, but it evolves also into like a compulsion. A compulsion meaning like an irresistible urge, like I have to take care of people. I have to be needed. I need to be needed. I need this person to need me. So that's going to make it hard for the other person to become independent at all because they need to be needed. So it goes from caretaking to an identity to a compulsion to like a trap and a really vicious cycle. And it's like we can't really get away from each other. And maybe we've tried to get away from each other, but we keep finding our way back here. And there might be seasons where we're not in each other's lives, but then we are in each other's lives, but then it gets really toxic really quickly. It's a cycle. It's a vicious cycle. I don't know how many times I'm going to say that this episode, but that really is what it becomes. And internally that develops, I don't know. I'm not sure actually which one comes first. I'm not sure if it develops a fear of abandonment or if it comes from a fear of abandonment. I think that sometimes it might come from a fear of abandonment, and it also perpetuates this fear of abandonment. Sometimes people who, and you know what, especially if we're thinking about the context of addiction, right? When people struggle with addiction and their family members maybe try to like establish a boundary and say like, no, I'm not going to support you in this thing. The narrative sometimes that comes back is, if you loved me, then you would help me in this way. If you loved me, then you would do X, Y, and Z. The love in that relationship is actually really conditional, but that plants the seed for this fear of abandonment, this fear of rejection, that the only way to stay in this person's life is to do what they want you to do. That's how you prove that you love them. And the way that they prove that they love you is by needing you. It's because I love you and I trust you. And so that's why I'm asking you this thing. And so the love, or the idea or concept of love, is directly attached to needing one another and to doing for one another. It's directly attached to what I can do for you, what you can do for me. If we're not doing for one another in that way, then there must not be any love. So if you don't need me, then you don't love me. So outside of this like original codependent relationship, let's say that we've gotten out of that and now we're wanting to form other relationships. Subconsciously, we may be drawn to people who are like maybe are a project or need some sort of rescuing, right? There's a confusion of love and pity or sympathy. People that have a lot of needs, people who don't have a lot of support, people who are really struggling in one way or another. Those are the kind of people that you're going to find yourself being drawn to, because that is your context for love. Essentially, if you see someone who has a lot of needs, what that is translated to is someone who has a lot of love, or a lot of love to give to you, because they have a lot of needs that you can potentially meet. So there is the neediness and the love become synonymous. That is dangerous. And it's really easy for some people to take advantage of that. So you can find yourself being easily manipulated, easily taken advantage of. Maybe you overextend yourself a lot very early in relationships for little return. Maybe you don't know how to say no, and then you feel unappreciated. These things come out very early. You also maybe are susceptible to more like love bombing behaviors and things. So we have to look at the way that we choose other people to be in our life. And are there maybe some of these other patterns that are still showing up there, whether they be in friendships, romantic relationships, or anything? So while we've set the foundation for codependency being the responsibility that we feel for other people's mental and emotional well-being, that might look a little bit differently just because people are always different. And maybe you've had some relationships in your life that just feel really heavy, or that just feel very, very involved. Maybe you have some relationships that you feel a great sense of obligation and responsibility in. I want you to think about those relationships. And I'm going to read off some characteristics of codependent people. And if you think that you might fall into this category, I want you to listen to these characteristics in the context of this relationship that's coming up for you that might feel unhealthy and that might feel a little bit lopsided, and that maybe requires a whole lot from you, especially with little return. So, do you feel an exaggerated sense of responsibility for the actions of others? So this is not just talking about how people feel, but it's also talking about what they do. When we are codependent, it extends beyond just someone's mental state. It extends to the things that they do and the ways that they live their life, and we take responsibility for that. If I had just driven them to their doctor's appointment, then maybe they wouldn't have driven drunk and gotten into a car accident. So it's my fault that they got into a car accident. Or if I had just answered the phone when he called, then maybe he wouldn't have gone and slept with somebody else. So it's partially my fault because I should have just answered the phone. So do you feel an exaggerated sense of responsibility for other people's actions? Do you have that tendency to confuse love and pity like we talked about earlier? Do you confuse neediness and love? Do those kind of become synonymous? Or maybe or at least in this relationship, if you think about the love or the alleged love that you and this person share, what does that love look like? How do you know that there is actually love there? And does it come down to the things that you are willing to do for them, or that maybe they're willing to do for you? Outside of that, what is the love? Do you have a tendency to do more than your share or overextend yourself pretty much all the time? Volunteering to do more, doing the majority of the work in the house or on the project or whatever it is? Do you have that tendency to do more than your share? Do you get hurt when people don't recognize your efforts? This is important because that's how we are going to feel loved by somebody else, or that's how we're going to feel that they are receiving our love, if they're recognizing the things that we're doing for them. So do you get hurt when you're not recognized for your efforts? Do you have an unhealthy dependence on relationships in general? What this looks like is going to all kinds of lengths to hold on to a relationship. Sometimes we are so scared to let go of a relationship. I think there are a lot of different reasons for that. Sometimes we just don't want to be alone. We feel like if this relationship ends, and it means that we have failed, that we are not good at relationships, that we are not cut out for relationships if this one ends. That's really heavy. That is really, really heavy. That's so much pressure to put on one relationship. But that's how we become codependent. We depend so much on the stability and maintenance of this relationship. If this relationship does not work or is not perfect, then I'm not perfect. Or if the relationship fails, then I'm a failure. And if the relationship fails and if the relationship fails and if they leave me, then there's something wrong with me. And it's that fear of abandonment and the rejection that comes up in that. So we become dependent on this relationship just existing, regardless of the quality of it, regardless of the health of it. And this is how we see people getting back into these really, really, really toxic relationships and staying for so long. These toxic, codependent, abusive relationships, they last for so long because the idea of ending it sometimes means admitting defeat, admitting failure. It means abandonment. It means rejection. And so that pain sometimes in our mind is too big and is enough to stay in the relationship in order to avoid some of that pain. So we might stay in the relationship, but we're suffering the whole entire time and we're actually not okay. Okay, codependent people also have an extreme need for approval and recognition. Maybe there's some sort of pattern of needing like external validation. That's probably a part of it as well. There's a sense of guilt when asserting yourself. And we also have a hard time with saying no because on some level, we feel like we're letting the other person down by not doing what they want or what they need, or that by somehow asserting our own wants and needs is too selfish and that we should just be putting our energy towards serving the other person instead. There's also this compelling need to control other people. And we probably wouldn't identify it that way, but when you think about it, the reason that we need the other person to need us is so that we can maintain this relationship, and it's so that we can keep them with us. So it's a bit manipulative in that way. I'm going to do all of these things so that you won't leave me. That is controlling. People have free will, which means that if somebody wants to leave, then they can do that. But we go to such lengths to keep people in our lives because on some level, we feel like if we didn't do these things, then they would leave us. And that leads into another characteristic, which is not trusting in yourself, not trusting that who you are is going to be enough for the right people in your life. If you don't believe that you have much to offer somebody outside of the external things that you can do for them, then you're going to put so much pressure on those external things and you're going to overextend yourself more so that the person will stay. You're going to ignore your own boundaries and wants and needs to make room for theirs so that they will stay. You maybe are going to be like really hypersensitive to the other relationships that they have in their life. Let's say that the person that you're in a codependent relationship with makes some other friends. You're probably going to want to know what's going on with those other friends and why do they want to hang out with them and why don't they just want to hang out with you? Look at all these things that I do for you. Why would you need another friend? Like it just goes on and it can really snowball, but it is a form of manipulation and control, partially because we do not trust ourselves or value ourselves enough to believe that what we bring to any relationship is enough without having to overextend ourselves. So those are some of the characteristics that might point to some codependent traits, either within you or in some of your relationships. So if you think that maybe you might be involved in some codependency, think about some of those traits. Well, most of this information that I'm getting is coming from Mental Health America. And there's also like a questionnaire on there that you can read through to kind of further assess whether or not you've got some codependent traits. But honestly, this is one of those things that I really feel like if you are concerned about whether or not you have some codependent traits, and if you've gotten this far in the episode and you've been able to identify some things within yourself, then I think that's enough for you to assess the way that you're moving in your relationships and do some of that inner work that's going to be necessary to move forward in more healthy ways. I don't think that you need a diagnosis or a professional necessarily to tell you that you're in a codependent relationship if you suspect that you might be in one. Even if it's not meeting like all of the criteria, if it is feeling unhealthy in some of these ways, then it's enough to be addressed. Honestly, I don't think that I think that sometimes we tend to justify and rationalize a lot of things because we don't want to acknowledge the fact that we might be in a codependent relationship. And maybe it's because we feel like if we acknowledge that, then our responsibility is going to be to leave. I don't think that that is always the case, that if you find yourself in a situation like this, that the only way out is to leave. Sometimes there might be circumstances where the people involved are both wanting to grow. I don't know that I've really seen it, but I have seen at least one person, the one who has the codependent traits. I have seen cases where that person is able to recognize how they're contributing to the toxicity and how their behaviors have been enabling. And they're willing to do the work to be able to have some more firm boundaries so that the relationship can be a little bit more healthy and mutually beneficial. So there is still hope if you're codependent or if you have some of these codependent traits, but it's so important that we not continue to rationalize and justify things within our relationships just because they've always been that way. And just because we do care about and love the people that we're in these relationships with. Y'all have heard me say time and time again, intent is different than impact. This is one of those cases where we don't want to acknowledge that we're in toxic situations because the other person maybe didn't have like malicious intention. And so it's hard for us to acknowledge that. But it doesn't mean that there are not unhealthy things that are happening here. Especially if, let's say it's like a romantic relationship, and if both of you have come from toxic environments and toxic relationships in the past, then it's kind of a sure thing that together it's going to be more toxicity. So at some point, somebody has to decide that they want better for themselves and they want healthier for themselves and that we want healthier for the people that we love. We have to be able to take a step back and look at how we're contributing to what's happening too. It's really easy to point the finger at the other person and say, they're just so needy. Stop being so needy. But you have to look at how quickly are you willing to offer to do something without even being asked? How quickly are you willing to overextend yourself and to ignore your own needs for someone else's? Is that a part of how you carry yourself in relationships? Do you have a hard time saying no? Do you have a hard time asserting yourself? Do you feel guilty when you don't do what someone else wants you to do? Do you feel guilty when you prioritize yourself at all? Do you tend to continue finding yourself in relationships with people who are extremely needy and who have high emotional needs and who maybe become dysregulated easily? Is that a pattern in your relationships? You really have to do some reflective work here to see what are some of the things that you've been contributing here so that you can find a healthier way forward. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, well, but Camille, we're Christians and we're here to serve other people. The Christian life is one of service, and Jesus was all about service and doing for other people. Yes. But what we also know is that Jesus took care of himself and he took care of other people. Just like we don't want to confuse love and pity, we also need not confuse service and martyrdom, like being a martyr and like completely putting your own life and well-being at the mercy of someone else's. Let's also not confuse service and idolatry. Let's not do that, because that's also what we're talking about here. That relationship and that person's well-being and that person's needs eclipses everything else. And that's not the type of loving Christian service that we are supposed to be offering to everyone in our life and to everyone that we come into contact with. That is very different. When you are in codependent relationships, everything else kind of goes out the window and that relationship becomes all consuming. How are you going to be good to your fellow man if your whole life is eclipsed by this one relationship and this one relationship is draining everything from you? And maybe that's the problem, is that we're not calling things out for what they are, because when we're in these kind of relationships, that is idolatry. We sacrifice so much for that relationship. And if that relationship is off the rocks, if that relationship is not going good, then we're not good and we're not okay. That relationship is the most important one in our life and the most important thing in our life. When we know that if anything becomes the most important thing besides God, then that thing has now become an idol. I think a good way to assess whether or not we're getting into the territory of idolatry is think about, how would you feel if that thing was taken away from you? So let's think about these codependent relationships. How would you feel if that relationship was taken away from you? If for whatever reason that person didn't need you anymore, wasn't in your life anymore, how would you feel? Would you crumble? Would you do everything that you could to try to get it back, even though you know that it's not good for you? We talked about that fear of abandonment before and holding on to the relationship at any cost. That's idolatry. That's idol worship. I'm not doing anything at any cost besides trying to please God and trying to be obedient to Him. But a relationship can absolutely become an idol. Another person can become an idol. Just because we haven't built a shrine in our house and we're not like physically bowing down to it, doesn't mean that it's not idolatry. When something consumes you, when it is the primary thing that you think about, when you sacrifice for it, when you put it before everything else, when you maybe compromise your own beliefs for the sake of this other person's beliefs or the sake of this other person's needs. Are we seeing the picture coming together now? And I guess maybe it's a little bit gray, because when we love people, and especially like if you're a very compassionate and empathetic person, we will go to the ends of the earth for the people that we love. And we should do for the people that we love. But the thing is that we should be mutually doing for one another. We do for people that we love when they cannot do for themselves. In these codependent relationships, it's not that they cannot do for themselves. It's that they would rather that you do it, or that they've gotten so used to you doing it, or that you want to actually do it because that's the function that you serve in their life. We are supposed to serve from a place of love, not from a place of obligation, manipulation, and control. That is not what we're here to do. Yes, we are here to serve other people because we're here to genuinely love other people. But the love of God is not one that only comes in the external things that we can produce and do for other people. That is not the love of God that we're supposed to be having for our fellow man. So the kind of love, or the alleged love that exists in these kinds of relationships, that's not the love that we're supposed to be showing to one another. The love that we're supposed to be showing to one another comes from a spiritual place, not from a physical place. So think about, where is this service coming from? Is it actually coming genuinely from a place of love? Or is it coming from a place of fear that you might lose this person if you do not serve in this way? Or that this is all you know to do, so you're going to continue to do in this way for this person because you feel obligated to do it, or because you don't want them to leave and you're trying to manipulate and control them? Where is it coming from? And are you serving anybody else from a place of love? Or is it all coming from a place of fear that you won't have anyone in your life and that you'll be completely alone and isolated? Service from a place of fear is not service. It is control. And we are not put here to control one another. We are put here to love one another. And sometimes loving someone means telling them no. Sometimes loving someone means having some healthy distance. Love is not about proximity. It's not about how close we can be to one another. Because with some people, the closer we are to them, the more toxic and the more dangerous it is, and the more hurtful we become to one another. And that is not love. In that case, the loving thing to do would be to keep some healthy distance so that we can continue to love one another well. That's what boundaries are. Boundaries are things and standards that are put into place so that we can continue loving one another well. If we know that when we're in close proximity together, that we just feed off of each other's trauma and we feed off of each other's triggers, and it just gets really like diabolical and really heated, then why would we continue to be in close proximity with one another? It's not good for either of us. It is hurting both of us. Where is the love in that? We have to stop confusing love and obligation. That's a really dangerous place to be. If we look at the way that Jesus served, it was never from that place of fear or obligation. It was always from a place of love. He didn't have to do anything that he was doing for people. He did it because he loved them. He did it because he was about his Father's business. That's why he was serving, not so that the people wouldn't leave. He didn't keep a lot of people around him on purpose, okay? And the people that were close to him and ended up leaving, he let them go. So that was never the case. The point was never to try to manipulate people to staying close. So if you're thinking about the context of servanthood, think about why we serve and how we serve, in contrast to the codependency that we find in our relationships. That is not the same thing. That's not what God wants for us. He does not want us to be in these kind of relationships that become idols and that are void of the love of God and that cause us more pain and more suffering and more trauma that we're not taking to him because we're probably in denial about it. Because if we acknowledge the pain and trauma that we're experiencing in this relationship, then we're going to have to acknowledge that this relationship probably is not good for us. And then we're sat with the decision. Do I just sit and stay in this relationship that's not good for me? Or do I, for once, prioritize myself? And we're probably not ready to make that decision yet. We push it to the back of our mind. So therefore, we're not even acknowledging the pain and suffering that this relationship is causing us, or we're not able to acknowledge it because it's all that we've known. And if it's all that you've known, then you probably are afraid of the unknown. Sometimes the unknown is the healthy thing. If all that I've known is toxicity, then I'm scared of what it means to be in a healthy relationship because I've never seen it. I've never known it. And we are terrified of the unknown, even if what's on the other side is less painful than this. We're going to convince ourselves that there's a different kind of pain that's probably worse than this. It's like stick with the devil that you know. I might as well stay with this kind of unhealthy relationship because it's all that I've known. And at least I know that they love me. And we are so afraid that God is not going to bring a better kind of love into our life, or that God is not going to restore our relationships, or he's not going to heal us enough to be in a healthy relationship. I've heard people say that they're not capable of being in a healthy relationship because they have never seen in one. They've never actually successfully done it. So then they doubt that they're able to. But we have to trust that God is able to heal us enough, and that he is healing whoever the right people for us, that he's healing them enough so that when we come into each other's lives, that we are not regressing and causing more pain and suffering, but that we're actually in a place where we can love one another the way that he commands us to. We want to get to a place where we are serving to please God instead of serving to please man. Something else that I was kind of thinking about and doing this episode is that when we are codependent and when we just need to be needed, in a way, we kind of develop this God complex and we feel so responsible for what other people do. And so we feel like we can manipulate them enough to do the things that we want them to do. And we get to a position where we really feel like we have much more authority over other people's lives than we do. We need to watch that. We really need to watch that. We become so consumed with somebody else's life that we believe the lie that we have authority over what they do and how they do it. There are some scary things that happen when we come into agreement with things like that, and when we come into agreement with people like that. On the flip side, it's hard to recognize sometimes when we're being controlled and manipulated and when someone else has taken authority over our life, because it's under the guise of love. And I'm doing this because I love you. So it's hard to recognize sometimes, which is also why I think these relationships last so long, because it's not blatant. But we do not have that kind of authority in anybody else's life. God is the only one who has that kind of authority. So if you're finding yourself really overextending and maybe trying to have more control over what someone else does, we need to really, really take a step back and reassess what's going on here. It's easy for that kind of stuff to snowball and to get away from you. But again, that is some dangerous territory. When we start to play God in other people's lives, we can't do that. We cannot do that. Because then we so busy playing God in somebody else's life. And are we even allowing God to be God of our life? If we were, then these things maybe wouldn't be happening like this. Probably not. I think that for people who are codependent and have a lot of these codependent traits, we're trying to fill some sort of void. We're trying to meet some need internally within ourselves through a relationship or through another person. We can't do that. Other people are not able to meet those internal needs for us. God is the one who can meet those needs for us. We're trying to meet the need for validation or for love or companionship or I don't know, whatever it is. But it's a need that shouldn't be someone else's responsibility, like another person's responsibility. Because God is the one who can meet that need for us and who should meet that need for us. I remember that I found myself trying to meet a need by way of a relationship or by way of a person. And it really kind of hit me in the face like a ton of bricks that I was not trusting that God could meet this specific need. And I think that's when we get into the territory of idolatry, when we believe that there is something that God cannot do for us, but that something else or someone else can. When you believe that someone or something else can do something because God cannot, at that point, you're putting them above God. At that point, it's becoming an idol. So I guess another question to ask yourself is, what's the need that I'm not trusting God with? What is the thing that I'm so afraid to let go of because I'm not trusting that God is going to restore it or that God is going to meet the need even better than I can? What is that thing? We got to let it go. We have to give it to him. We have to surrender that need to God if we're able to identify it. And if we're not able to identify it, then we got to ask God to show us, what is the need, God, that I am strangling right now? What is the need that I need to surrender to you? What is the thing that I'm not allowing you to do for me? Because I promise God can do it better than you can. God can show up and fulfill this thing way better than you can and better than this other person can, because the other person is a person. The other person is a human. We can't put that type of faith in people. They are always going to let us down. Always, always, always. So what's the thing that you have not yet surrendered to God within yourself, within your relationships? Do you believe that you're not good enough to find other people and that no one's going to love you like this person is going to? Like, is that the belief? What are the core beliefs here? Again, like, what are the spaces that you need to invite God into to heal you enough to help you be in healthy, secure, loving relationships? Okay, that's going to bring us to our scripture for the day. We are coming today from Isaiah chapter 40, and we're going to be looking at verse 28 through 31. It says, "Have you never heard? Have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding. He gives power to the weak and strength to the powerless. Even youth will become weak and tired, and young men will fall in exhaustion. But those who trust in the Lord will find new strength. They will soar high on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint." I think for me, this was just a reminder that God is the only one who can really strengthen and give us the things that we need. God is the only one who can meet every single need. God's the only one who can meet every single need for us and for other people. So whether you are the one who is really needy in your relationships, or if you're the one who is dependent on meeting someone else's need, know that God is the only one who can stand in the gap and really do what we need on every single level. I think we need that reminder sometimes because of what I said earlier about taking authority in other people's lives. We take so much on our back when it comes to the other person and what they need. And we just feel like if we don't do it, then they're never going to get it done. If we don't do it, then they're not going to be okay. If we don't do it, then they're going to fail. Why would we put that much on ourselves? It's not fair to anybody involved. It's not fair to you because it's setting an expectation of perfection that does not and should not exist. It's not fair to you because your whole life becomes about someone else and then you have nothing left for yourself. It's not fair to the other person because you're not perfect and because you're going to let them down at some point. Also because it doesn't give them space to grow into whoever it is that they're trying to become, or whoever it is that they're supposed to become. It keeps them stuck in this place of dependence. It keeps them stuck like developmentally in needing someone else and not actually being able to take accountability for anything else in their life. And they're also not depending on God. They're depending on you. That mindset completely erases God from the equation, when in reality, he's the only one that needs to be in the equation. So that's just a reminder that when we rely on other people, it's not going to get us far. We're going to be let down. We're going to be hurt. We're going to get tired. It's not sustainable. It's not healthy. When we rely on God, the sky's the limit. When we rely on God, He is capable of doing things in our life that we could never imagine. And He wants to do those things because He loves us. But if we are just so dead set on depending on other people instead of depending on God, or depending on ourselves instead of depending on God, then we're never going to be able to get where He's trying to take us. When we really care so much about people that we're wanting to overextend and we're wanting to do, we also need to acknowledge that they need God more than they need us. And so sometimes we have to step back to make room for God in their life. Because if we didn't, then they would just keep relying on us and keep relying on us and keep relying on us. We cannot take God's place in anyone's life. We shouldn't be taking God's place in anyone's life. And no one else should be taking God's place in our life. That is imbalanced. So in all of your relationships, what is the hierarchy? Where is God in all of your relationships? We talk about this a lot in like marriage and romance, but where is God in all of your relationships? Is God in your relationships? Even if it's just in the God that you're bringing to the relationship. Because we know that you can still have relationships with non-believers and people who maybe are not in the same place spiritually, but are you bringing God to the relationship? How are you walking in obedience, and how are you showing the love of God in this relationship? If you are taking so much responsibility and obligation for the other person's well-being, then we need to readjust some things and allow room for God to shine through you instead, and allow room for God to maybe do a work that you're not able to do. Okay, let's move on. That's going to bring us to our question of the day. Just as a reminder, if you have a question that you want answered on the show, you can send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. You can leave a comment here on YouTube, wherever you're listening to this, or on social media at Therapy and Prayer. Today's question says, how do you navigate people in your life who don't agree with you and don't want you to change? This is so appropriate, I think, because we're talking about codependency and we're talking about having control in our relationships, and maybe people having control over us in our relationships. Something that I heard a while ago and that has always stuck with me is that the people who take issue with you having boundaries are the ones who benefited from you having none. Codependent relationships are relationships with absolutely no boundaries at all. So if someone doesn't want you to change, it's probably because your change is going to limit their access to you, and they don't like that. That's very toxic. The people who truly love you want you to grow and evolve, or they should want you to grow and evolve. Now, there is something to be said for people having to adjust to the changes within you. And we can give a little bit of grace in that area. Sometimes it's hard for people to get used to your new way of being or of interacting with them. And they're not always going to like it. And that's okay. They don't always have to like it. If you are so dependent on other people's acceptance or validation, then that's something else for you to look at. We really should not put that much weight on whether or not other people like what we are doing for our life. So there's some potential codependency on both sides. People are not always going to like the things that you do, maybe because they wouldn't make that decision for their life. And that's okay. They don't have to. But do they want you to make decisions that are going to be healthy for you? If everyone in your life is telling you that this is not a healthy decision, then maybe we can kind of reassess and think about it. But I think that this question generally is speaking to people who don't want things to change in their relationship with you, because it's going to be too hard for them to adjust, or they're not going to have the same kind of access to you, or they don't want things to change, or I don't know, they're afraid of change or whatever it is, but they want you to be stagnant because that's more comfortable for them. I think that in some ways, I also speaks to the quality of the relationship that you're in. When we have these kind of conflicts and people don't want us to grow and don't want us to change, and they're mad because we're growing and we're changing, I think that says a lot about the relationship. That maybe that relationship was not as mutually beneficial, or maybe that relationship was one of control. That relationship was not one that was rooted in the love of God that we should have for one another. But also, our personal growth and change cannot be for other people. If the changes that you're making in your life are for the benefit, specifically and exclusively for the benefit of someone else, those changes are not going to last. They're just not, because they are conditional on the other person's approval. So if for whatever reason, like the other person just becomes like indifferent about these changes that you've made, then you're going to start questioning them and questioning yourself. Or sometimes you'll change so that you can be in a relationship with the other person. And then when you get in that relationship, those changes don't last because they served a specific purpose, a specific function. So any change that is dependent on the approval of someone else, I don't think that's a real lasting change. So if you're in a position where you're really trying to grow and change some things for yourself because it's going to be good for you and because it's going to help you be more pleasing to God, I think God's approval is really the only one that matters in those circumstances. There are some things that will really show us who people are, and that will really show us maybe the quality or the longevity of our relationships. A relationship really cannot prove itself until it's tested. And sometimes that test looks like the way that we navigate change, the way that we support one another through change. If we don't navigate that well, and if we can't support one another well through it, then maybe that has just shown some cracks in the relationship. Maybe that has just shown us that this relationship was not meant to be one of significance beyond this point. Maybe so. Or maybe it's an opportunity to try to really elevate your communication with that person. Maybe it's an opportunity to try to help them understand you a little bit better. But if they don't rise to the occasion at that point and find a way to still support you on your own personal journey, then maybe that's not a relationship that you need to be trying to keep. I'm sorry, I hate to say it. I mean, like, sorry, not sorry. But these kind of questions, like, what do we do if someone doesn't want us to change? You can decide, I guess. Don't change then. Like, I'm not going to tell you don't change because someone else doesn't want you to. I'm not going to tell you that. What do we do if someone doesn't like what we're doing? Do you like what you're doing? Does God like what you're doing? Again, are we placing that person in the position that only God should hold? Maybe there's a little bit of a balancing act here. Maybe because like, okay, we shouldn't be like super self-centered in life and only do things that please ourselves because we're to be here of service. But why does this person have an issue with what it is that you're doing? Is it because it's no longer going to benefit them? And are they coming from a place of love? If they're not coming from a place of love, then I think that if it were me, I probably would be okay with rejecting that feedback. I do not have to accept every piece of feedback that other people give me. I do not have to accept what other people want me to do. I simply don't. You're welcome to share it, and I'm welcome to accept it or reject it. That's that. It really is that. We cannot be so afraid of losing a relationship that we instead lose ourselves. That's too risky. It's too risky. God's going to restore it. If that relationship has come to an end, God's going to bring another one tenfold. He's going to bring another one that is so much more loving and grounded and rooted in Him and beneficial for the both of you. So I think that we need to find a way to be less fearful of losing relationships. I think that sometimes there's like a purging that happens and we go through a season where people are leaving our lives left, right, and center, like willfully or unwillfully, voluntarily or not. Like I think sometimes there's a purging that has to happen. And a lot of times that purging is in alignment with our own personal growth and evolution. I don't think that that is coincidental or accidental. I think that that's a part of the process and that is a part of the evolution. So if other people are going to leave your life because they don't like what you're doing, then we pray that God is going to bring the right people into your life that are going to support you on the journey that He has you on. Okay? All right. I don't know how long that was, but I think that's all I have to say about this subject, at least for now. This is one of those that I maybe could see us coming back to. Let me stop saying that. I don't think I've ever come back to a topic that I said we might come back to. And I'm sorry for those of y'all who have been looking for part 2. It might happen one day. Anyway, thank y'all for being here. I love you so much. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the Spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.